All right, Adam, let's wrap this one up. You've got an untimely review for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are not influential enough or rich enough to get games ahead of time and get them reviewed to you before they get released. So we review them as we can, when we can, on our own time, on our own dime. And we bring those reviews when we can, making them untimely reviews. Adam, this week you said that you played 12 minutes. I've heard mixed things about this game, so I'm excited to see what you have to say.
Yeah, I was really excited for it just for the fact that I like these little quick, like, couple hour story crazy games. And then when you tell me that James McAvoy and oh my god,
Daisy Ridley.
Well, that too, but oh my god, this is twice now that I'm blanking up on names that I shouldn't be. Willem Dafoe. Jeez, well, at least I figured that one out. Sorry, Miyamoto, I'm bad. I somehow remember Willem Dafoe, but not you. What a great gamer I am. But like when you got a really interesting voice cast like that gets my attention too. I'm like, oh, okay, so this could be like really good really good voice acting, along with like a pretty interesting story. So I went into it kind of just hoping that I get something pretty cool, something like really interesting and things that kind of push the limits of what we kind of expect from games. And yeah, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Like by the time that I finished it, I didn't leave it thinking like, oh man, what a waste of time this was. But I also didn't leave the game being like, man, like this blew it out of the water. Like I went like, no, this is fine. This is a decent experience. It didn't take too much time, and it had some cool ideas. The idea of it just being basically like this really short, like 8-minute loop that you have to like. Well, I guess you could say 12-minute loop, but it's technically more like 8 to 10 minutes. I mean, in the early parts of the game, it's not 12 minutes. You have a much short amount of time. It's being able to do certain steps that allows you to get to like that extra couple of minutes. But it's the idea of like every time you go back into the same loop, you get like another idea that gets you that much closer to figuring out something further. Maybe you learn an extra bit of thing maybe an extra keyword to speak to somebody in the dialogue. Maybe you get a different answer that gives you something else to say, or maybe you find something and maybe that adds on to stuff. So it was interesting that like you would play these loops and constantly sit there and be like, okay, what haven't I tried yet? What order of things haven't I done? And for the most part, it worked pretty well. It took me at one point, I got stuck that I needed to Google one thing just to figure out like how to deal with one specific problem. And as soon as I got the answer, I said, how would I have known that? Because there's one specific bit that like, it gives you a tiny bit of information, but then it doesn't tell you that if you do it again, something bad can happen on top of that. My brain goes, if something bad happens the first time, I'm not doing it a second time, but apparently the game wanted me to do it the second time so I would learn that that's something I could use. I'm like, so great, because I was trying to be safe, it cost me not knowing what to do in the game. So that was a little bit frustrating, but I mean, otherwise, it was pretty easy to go through. You figure out one more thing, you try something different, you try a different like order of things, and then it gets to the end where you're like, okay, I need to do like these 5 things in a very short window to make sure I have enough time to do what I want to do here. And then you get into all the endings where I got specifically one ending, and I've seen a whole bunch of other ones. Some of them I'm like, man, you could not pay me to do that intentionally. There's a couple endings that I'm like, I could not do that. There's one specifically called the coward ending that I could never imagine doing. Unless it's in real life, then maybe I could get pressured into that, because you never know, which I think is the beauty of an ending like that, because it shows like the reality of what a situation could lead to, because you don't know how you'd react to certain things. But overall, like, there's nothing I can say about the game like that isn't like going to be spoilery, because it's such a small, like, story-driven game. The gameplay is so basic. It's just like, it's almost like a point and click. Like, you just go and puzzle your way through the story. The acting is fine. Like, I actually, if I hadn't known that James McAvoy, Daisy Ridley, and Willem Dafoe were in it, I wouldn't have noticed, because none of the voices were like obvious.
In a good way or a bad way? Like, do you find like it was a waste of the talent, or was it just not utilized properly, or is this a compliment that it is?
You know what? I'm gonna say it was a waste of the talent because it didn't stand out. I didn't feel like any one of the 3 were like, holy shit, like I'm gonna remember that voice acting. I didn't. You could have put any 3 random actors in there and it probably would have been fine. Which is a shame, because you kind of hope for something a little bit different. It may also be that the voices they didn't use like a voice that we're normally used to hearing them with. Like, Willem Dafoe wasn't over the top. James McAvoy wasn't using his like Charles Xavier voice. So like, you weren't getting like voices that you were familiar with. You were just getting like almost like different voices that you never heard before. So you wouldn't really have known the difference of it. So I don't know. It was weird.
Like, let's talk like focusing on this, because I feel like that was one of the main selling points of this game was the actors. Do you find that maybe we didn't recognize the voices, but were the lines acted out in a way that it was convincing, or did it come across as just bland and generic?
Well, in terms of like it coming across the way it was supposed to, it did just fine. But like I said, like it's not something that like you remember certain voice actors in games. Like, you're not going to remember the same way you remember like an Ellie in The Last of Us kind of deal, right? Like, it's not that. It's more of it's more the story and the process of trying to get your way through that was more interesting. Like, the voice acting is more like the background music, because there is music, but you don't really notice because you're more focused on like the key things you need to listen to. So you could almost say like it was. The voice acting does what background music for a lot of games do, where you don't notice the music because it's doing a good job of keeping you like in the game and not thinking too much outside of it. But like, again, for a game that was advertising like two actors specifically in McAvoy and Dafoe that I'm pretty familiar with, and me leaving that game being like, you could have put anybody else in there and said that, oh, that was James McAvoy, and I would have been like, really? I wouldn't have known the difference.
Yeah, that's too bad that like that they didn't really bring anything to the table.
But I mean, if it was acted out really well, maybe that was all they were looking for. Who knows?
Now, did you find that the story was compelling and like you were eager to see what happened next, or was it kind of a bit of a slog?
Here's the problem. Like, it's hard to say if that's even a thing you can have in this game, because there's such short loops. You're more like focusing on how to get out than you are like the story that's going on. There's somewhat of a weird story that goes on with it, but by the time it got to that, I was already like, I've already figured out the core puzzle of the game. Like, at this point, I didn't leave the story being like, man, like that was a really cool twist. I was more at the end just being like, hey, I made it to the end. It was more like going through a puzzle game than anything else. Like, I really do feel like it's a puzzle game that happens to have a story in it.
Okay.
Which, depending on what you're looking for in that kind of game, isn't a bad thing. But like, if you're going in thinking it was going to be this, you know, like something akin to like a Firewatch or a Gone Home or even a Life is Strange, depending on how you think about those games. 12 minutes isn't quite that, but I think it has more to do with the fact that it's a shorter game with these loops. So it doesn't have a lot of time to really tell a story. It's a very small fragment. Like, 12 minutes is like playing like a chapter of Life is Strange. Or not even a chapter, like maybe like an act of a chapter. Like, it's not much. There's not a lot of meat to chew on. It's more the puzzle and figuring out how to get out of that story. That's more the selling point of the game once you play it. So if you're going in expecting, you know, something like, again, like a Firewatch, you're probably not going to get the same value. You're going to get something a little bit different. Yeah.
Now, in terms of, because you said you got the one ending and you kind of finished it, were you compelled to kind of go in and try different ways of getting the stories, or was it just
I basically went to YouTube and watched the rest, because I'm like, because I knew a lot of the endings I was going to have to figure out. Like, there were two other endings I knew I could get immediately because there were choices. Because I was at the, like, pick this to get the ending stuff. But in any of the other specific cases, there's some of the endings that, well, it's hard to call them endings. Like, they're more just like, they're more specific points that like could feel like an end, but you still go back into the loop kind of like ending. Like, when you look at if you ever like complete the game once and then look at the YouTube video for all the endings, you're going to think like, is that really an ending? Because it just puts you back in the loop again. Because, I mean, you can get you can get killed essentially in the game and you just go back into a loop. And there are endings that are similar to that, where it's just like something bad happens, so it just puts you back in the loop again. Or something good happens, but it's not the true ending, so you're back in the loop. You don't get that. You don't get any sort of resolution or conclusion in terms of like actual conclusive endings where like the loop is over. I think there's like 2 endings, but there's more like they claim that there's more akin to like 8 to 10.
Interesting. So, what's your recommendation? What's your rating? Where do you fall in this game?
If you have Game Pass, it's an easy recommend because you're not
Okay.
buying it. If you're buying it, I'd wait for it to go half off. I can't
Okay.
imagine it at anything else. Like it's too short, and it's also not quite what I think a lot of people were expecting from it. So I would go in like with some sort of like casual, like just kind of peeking at it, sort of like just keep a close eye on it, and maybe just like look at a couple reviews of what other people are saying about it just to get a sense of it. But I mean, again, like it's not something that I would go and pay a decent amount of money for. This is like a $10 game to me.
Now, are you saying that this is something that like people should give it a shot, like even like if it goes on half price, or is it like only go into this if you're interested?
If it's half off, I say go for it.
Okay.
I think it's unique enough and interesting that it does what it needs to do. And I can easily recommend it if you're a puzzle game guy. Otherwise,
Awesome.
otherwise it's a half off game to me.